This is FX Medicine. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook, and we're at the 2017 United in Compassion Symposium in Melbourne. I'm here talking with Dr. Sue Sisley.
You got it.
From America, and you're doing some research which is actually dear to my heart because I have such honour for our men and women who serve in any armed force or any service.
Yeah.
So I'd like to give you a personal thank you for doing that sort of research.
That.
But I guess first take us through your history as a medical doctor. How did you first become interested in the application of medical cannabis to help people?
Sure. I just began hearing reports from the veteran community that were claiming, some really remarkable medical benefit. They said that the symptoms of their PTSD were starting to be very responsive to cannabis, and they were reluctant to share this with me because they knew I was highly conservative and probably would be very judgmental. But eventually I just couldn't ignore them because they were corroborated by all their family members who said, I got my dad back, I got my husband back. It was just so impressive that this plant was so transformative for them. So eventually I still didn't really buy the idea of cannabis as a medicine, but I felt we owed it to the veterans to at least study it in a rigorous and controlled environment. And so that's how we started embarking on this study. I'd been involved in some legalization campaigns around the U.S. because I just believe in this as a social justice issue. I think that the harms of criminalizing this plant have been very detrimental to society. So we also launched a charity called Doctors for Cannabis Regulation, and we're trying to encourage people to go look at this website and join. The membership is free, and we need the numbers in order to create a groundswell of public pressure. But our charity is striving to end cannabis prohibition internationally, and so we started our work in the U.S., but now we found physicians all over the world that are now joining forces with us, and so it's been really wonderful to see how this has resonated.
And indeed, you spoke just before about social justice, and one of the things that really tugged at my heart was the number of war veterans that we lose to suicide.
Yeah.
But it's termed something different.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. This is interesting because I wear this dog tag because the veterans put together this to build public awareness about the epidemic of veteran suicide, and I didn't realize that Australia is grappling with the same thing here,
absolutely.
that your veterans also are plagued with the same problem, and the treatments are so disappointing. The current treatments don't really work, and you could see from the veterans who were on that panel that they're suffering, and they discovered cannabis and they found it life-saving. And I think that's the message to the government, is that if you have this number of veterans that are reporting therapeutic benefit, then we owe it to these guys to at least and look, we have other countries that have already developed more progressive policies, like Israel and Canada, that have created a system where military veterans can not only legally access cannabis, but it's fully sponsored by the federal government, where they pay for the cost of the cannabis. Yeah, I think that should be a model for the world. Why is it that and it's not just the group who's in there, it also represents all the first responders, right? So veterans plus firemen, policemen.
Yep.
And I think that's when I talked in my lecture about finding unlikely allies, I think that's essential, that we identify these other groups of folks that may not be out of the closet yet with their usage, but may be able to, we might encourage them. We've had, in the States, we're seeing more and more suicides among the firemen, and firemen have an incredibly profound problem with untreated PTSD. And these guys are, they spend their career going to, traumatic accidents, really horrific
physical affront.
Yeah, horrific scenes that they can't shake later. They just, all those dark thoughts swirling in their head all the time. And so if we can engage these other communities and bring them together with us, I think will be much more powerful.
It's just twigged something in my mind and about the importance of recognising it's not just armed services, but it's indeed what you say, the first responders. I can still remember an old fiery. And his PT, in fact, no, he was an ambulance officer. And his first responding PTSD was the sign on the windscreen, baby on board. They didn't find the baby in an MBA. So it was just a horrific nightmare. So moving on from that, one thing that interests me is those members of our first responders forces, if you like, that are bound by their legal framework, and that is the police force.
Yes.
So given that these men and women have to go into situations very often where they may not come out alive, they do not know what's behind that door, they don't know whether the person is armed or not or hasn't something pointed at them. How do you find the conservatism of law is versus the personalised feelings around the medical use of an illegal substance to ease their pain?
Yeah. Well, I think that's what's been surprising is that how many, especially retired police officers, are utilizing cannabis to manage their PTSD and other ailments, but are not able or willing to come out of the shadows and talk about that. The other thing, we're seeing this, almost, how do you say, like almost an epidemic of police shootings, sort of unwarranted police shootings. And a lot of people are theorizing that these are related to untreated PTSD. There's the policemen are sort of on a hair trigger. They're hyper vigilant and they're constantly on guard and overly apt to use their gun inappropriately. So that's part of the concern, is that the police community is unable to, they make so much money off of seizing cannabis that the chance of changing policy is going to be a long road. And I don't know if we'll ever be able to fully engage the police force behind, but certainly firemen are, they're a good target for us, and I think we should try to bring them into the fold.
So you're researching the medicinal benefits of cannabis in PTSD. Take us through your research. What are the hurdles that you've faced, and what sort of results are you seeing, if in a preliminary sort of way?
Sure. I would say, the hurdles are, just a kind of an endless list of regulatory barriers that have prevented the work for many years. But now, after 7 years, we finally have implemented the trial. We're fully underway. The biggest challenge is probably the fact that we were required to force patients to smoke in front of us. So the fact that we were doing a smoking study was already controversial. But the data on smoking is impressive, that there is really no evidence that cannabis smoke causes any long-term lung complications. I think that's a really misconception among a lot of people, that somehow smoking may lead to lung cancer. We still don't have any published data to support that idea. So, and that's why the FDA allowed our study to proceed with smoking as the delivery method, because they also couldn't uncover any data that would speak otherwise. So, but in fact, there's a lot of folks that are reluctant to host a study where we are, asking people to smoke in front of us, and it creates a lot of anxiety among property owners. So that's part of why the university tossed us out, because they didn't like the optics of having veterans smoking weed on campus, and they thought it might harm their federal funding. And so we're happily independent now, and we're functioning as a private entity with a private ethics committee overseeing our work. But the good news is that the data will soon be available. We have a cohort, we have a companion study happening in Canada. So we've given our protocol to our colleagues at Tilray.
Repeatability.
Yes, and so they've taken the same protocol but expanded it slightly, which we welcomed, where they're looking at PTSD of all causes. So they'll include veterans, first responders, rape victims,
violence,
everybody.
yeah.
And they also, instead of smoking, they're doing the vaporizer arm of our study. So everybody will be vaping in that. And then we'll see how, we'll eventually, in a few years, we'll be able to compare all the data and get it published. We put all the data into the public domain. So that's important, unlike big pharma that only allows select data to be, and I did trials for big pharma for years, and I was always really discouraged to see how much data never saw the light of day.
Right.
If it didn't make their study drug look favorable, it would never be seen. So instead, we put everything, the good and the bad of cannabis will all be put in published.
So that's something I was going to ask you
Yeah.
about. We all like to think of it as this wonderful thing, but there was a really good TED talk by a doctor who said, look, the effects that I've seen, and he doesn't use cannabis, but he said the effects I've seen aren't as good as the hype would make you believe, but it's certainly not as bad as the people that would denigrate cannabis would have you believe it. It benefits some and it doesn't benefit others.
Right.
Have you seen any areas that it just simply doesn't work, and B, how has the response been, or the receptivity been, by those who would otherwise frown on the use of cannabis, who would not deign to take it recreationally, those more conservative people?
Right.
What's been their acceptance?
Well, I would say, first of all, certainly it's a drug like anything. There are risks and there are benefits. So like any medicine, there are certain patients that will never respond to cannabis, even though there are hundreds of different phenotypes. So there may be, it may just be a matter of helping the patient find that specific chemovar that really works for them. But and that's why patients go on this odyssey. When they first start treatment, they'll usually, it could take them a full year to experiment with different phenotypes until they find that best fit that really works for them. So that's the challenge, is trying to persuade lawmakers that marijuana isn't just one topic. It's a very complex plant with hundreds of different varieties. And it's a matter of, some of the varieties are activating, some are sedating. So it's a matter of patients struggling to find that best fit that matches their needs. But in terms of, and side effects, sure, we've seen a number of side effects even in the course of our clinical trial. We've seen veterans with significant nausea and vomiting. We've seen veterans with paranoia and mild psychosis. And others who've just flown through the whole process beautifully without any side effects. So, and no side effects and only pleasant drug effects, So everybody's unique, and I think that's the main thing that for lawmakers to see that this is how do you say that the complexity of the plant is not something to be afraid of. It's something to be embraced. Unlike pharma, where they just devising one molecule to target one receptor in the body. The beauty of this plant is that it can target multiple receptors and be able to really create a very broad therapeutic effect that can treat a lot of different ailments.
And so the receptivity of the more conservative people?
Oh, yeah.
Have you had any?
Surprisingly, the conservatives are starting to come around because, especially if they tend to lean libertarian anyway, they understand that this plant, it's a natural plant that should be made available to people, and it should really be treated more like an herbal supplement. I think a lot of physicians now recognize that it's not about rescheduling, it's about taking cannabis off of the controlled substance list because
altogether.
A lot of physicians recognize that this plant has been unfairly vilified for decades, and it's not. It really the side effect profile of cannabis is still benign enough that it probably should be treated like an herbal product. In herbal products, we don't, put them on a control. Even, St. John's wort, all these other drugs, they're made available through a health food store, and that's probably where, plant needs to be. But right now, the addiction potential of cannabis is so overstated by prohibitionists, and it really probably isn't much more addictive than a cup of coffee. If you look at it, it's not more addictive than caffeine. And so I think we have a long way to go, and hopefully, clinical trials like this will help lawmakers, will arm them with the data they need. That's what they desperately need access to objective data. And trials like this, we're determined to put cannabis through the entire FDA drug development process. So everybody thinks that's a pie in the sky.
But not as a pharmaceutical, as a broad spectrum plant.
It's a botanical, So we're, and we're not that far away. This study is a phase 2 trial, and after phase 2, we should be allowed to move to phase 3. And if the data from phase 3 is compelling, then this drug could be on the market with an FDA indication for PTSD. So we'll see what happens, but I think that everybody assumes that that's a pie in the sky idea to put cannabis through the whole FDA process, but it's really, we're not that many years away from completing that.
Really applaud your high quality, high caliber work to help people, and indeed, as I said, that are dear to my heart. So thank you so much from a personal and professional note, Dr. Sue Sisley.
Thank you.
This is FX Medicine. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook.